I'm going to share with you all today a few funny things that mothers say and see if any of these sound like something your mother said to you or maybe something you have said. Let's see. Because I said so. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Chew with your mouth closed. Clean your plate because somewhere children are starving. Wash your hands or anything else. If everybody jumped off a cliff, would you? When you have children of your own, you will understand. Any of those sound familiar? You know, it's interesting to me how the things that we say have such impact that some of those things I couldn't remember until I put the list together, and the list just kept going and going. One of the things my mother often said, and I remember her saying some of those things as well, but she would say, "For Pete's sake," when she was mad. And my brothers would say, "Who's Pete?" And she would just get more mad. Now, if you look it up, you'll find out that saying started around 1900 because people wanted a way to cuss without cussing. Turns out you can take the name of Peter the disciple in vain, but you cannot use the name of the Lord in vain. So when you say "for Pete's sake" or "for the love of Pete" or "for pity's sake," you get to cuss without actually cussing. Now that has nothing to do with our reading today. That was totally extra, no charge. Just thought you'd like to know that little bit of trivia. I looked it up as I thought about my mom this week, and I remembered that saying. Now, our mothers do influence us greatly, and because tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I decided to go back and see what I could find out about his mother, Alberta King. And she did say something to him and to the rest of the children very often, and it was not anything unusual for black families in that time. She would often say to them, "You are as good as anybody." Not better than anybody, not less than anybody, but you are as good as anybody. And it was important for her to say that to her children because the world was telling them something completely different. The world was telling them, "You can't come in the front door of this store, you have to come in the back. You can't drink from this water fountain, you've got to drink from that one. You cannot play in the public park because of the color of your skin. You cannot swim in the public pool. You do not get to sit in the front of the bus. And if someone else gets on the bus and their skin is white, you may have to give up your seat." So constantly, black children were bombarded with the message that they are not good enough, that they are not part of this same family. And so Alberta would tell her children, "You are as good as anybody." And she shaped her son. Christine, his sister, Martin's sister, had said laughingly that people just think that Martin Luther King Jr. just arrived fully formed, ready to lead the civil rights movement. But he didn't. He arrived just like everybody else, into the same system as everybody else. And it was his parents, his grandparents, particularly his mother, who shaped him, who empowered him to be the person that he was. And in our reading today, we'll see the same with Jesus. That Jesus' mother also has an impact on him that at first reading of that text that Andy shared with us, we don't notice. Now, we are in John's Gospel, and I love John's Gospel because it is weird. It is hard to understand. You got to dig through the layers of it. I often tell people, do not read this Gospel literally, or you will miss most of the meaning. It is, according to Dr. Elaine Pagel's, Gnostic flavored, which means it's heady stuff. There's all kinds of hidden messages and meanings, at least according to those who subscribe to that belief. But I do find that I get a lot more out of John's Gospel if I'm willing to spend the time looking for the symbolism. Now, there's one line that I want to call your attention to before we dive into the actual story, and that is the first line that Andy read today. On the third day, they go to a wedding, and Jesus' mother is there also. Those are two references. The third day should remind you of another third day that's going to come at the end of this gospel, right? What happens on the third day? Jesus rises from the dead. But the note about his mother being there also is significant, because when Jesus is hanging on the cross, only in this gospel, not in the others, his mother is there too. And so from the very beginning of this gospel, we have this thin thread that connects us all the way to the end, that is foreshadowing what's going to happen later, that's tying the whole thing together for us. So let's keep that in mind as we dive into the story. We know there's a wedding, right? Who's getting married? We don't know. There's nobody named. We don't know who's getting married. We don't know their names. We don't know how they're related to Jesus. We know nothing about them. They are as far as we can tell, a fictional couple. Let's remember something else about John's gospel. It is more philosophic than historic. There's more theology than any historicity. So it really doesn't matter who got married or if there even was a wedding, but we don't know who these people are. And we know that they were getting married in Cana, right? Where's Cana? Now, if you go to Israel, if you go to the Holy Land, there will be a tour bus that's going to take you to Cana and say, this was Cana, and they're going to charge you money for your ticket. But if you call an archaeologist and ask, where is Cana? They'll say, we have no idea. There is no place that we can find the remains of that fits the description of Cana. So we've got this fictitious couple getting married in a fictional place. Very interesting. That tells us that we need to look for the symbolism in this story. We cannot just read it at face value and understand what the author is trying to say to us. We have a wedding. Jesus is there. The disciples are there. Jesus' mother is there. And this family runs out of wine. Now, in my book, that's not a big deal. You just drink water, right? You drink something else. No problem. But it is a problem in this time and place, because water is often polluted and scarce. And when you throw a wedding, it's not one day, it's 7. You invite all of your family and friends from everywhere, and they all travel to your home, and guess who feeds them? You do. Guess who gives them something to drink? You do. That's hospitality. So for this family to run out of wine, this is a big social problem. They have got to have something to offer their guests. And we don't even know what day the wedding started. Maybe this is the 3rd day of the wedding too. But still, that leaves 4 more days and nothing to drink. So it is a big problem. The mother of Jesus, who is not named in this entire gospel, if the only gospel you had was John's gospel, you would not know the name Mary because it's never used. She sees that there's no wine, and she says to Jesus, they're out of wine. And then we know that she directs the servants to do whatever he tells them, and they bring water to put in these stone jars, and the water becomes wine, and the problem is solved. And in the middle of all that, there's this sign, this creative sign that is supposed to prove to us and to the disciples that Jesus is the Messiah, because he can turn water into wine. Now, let's look for the symbolism before we go any further. Let me think of who the scholars are that I read. There were so many articles. Ernest Hess, Carol Hess. Another one, I want to give you the names so you know I don't make this stuff up, because I really don't. Linda Bridges is the other one. They say that these stone jars are a symbol of the old order, the way things always have been, the way religion was practiced. And so I began to look at these jars a little more closely. Each one of these 6 stone jars holds 20 to 30 gallons. So imagine for a moment a 55-gallon drum. That's 2 stone jars. So we're talking about a lot of wine. There are 6 of these jars. And if they are symbolic of the old order, that means something has to change, because that's what Jesus comes to do, right? To change, to transform us. Now, these stone jars are ceremonial washing jars. That means they're always filled with water, so that when you are unclean, you have a place where you can go to get this water to clean yourself. The old order said that sin and uncleanness were connected. So if you touched a dead body, maybe you butchered an animal. Something happened. You were unclean. You couldn't go to the temple. You couldn't participate in the religious ritual. So you would have to go wash with this ceremonial washing of water from these jars. And if you were a woman and you were on your monthly cycle, you also were unclean. And there was another whole ritual for you to do with water to be clean. So sin and this idea of not being clean, they're really connected. So the water jars are an important part of that old order. They support that whole system. Now, the wine is symbolic of God's abundance. All through Scripture. If you see wine, you might want to ask, is this a symbol of something else? Because wine is always a symbol of the abundance of God's grace and God's love and God's protection and God's providence and God's everything, provision. Everything is there. It's abundant and it's for everyone. So to take the old order that deals with people who are clean or unclean and replacing it with wine where everyone is included, that's a picture of the incoming realm of God. This is Jesus' whole job, right? To do away with the old order so that the realm of God can arrive and we can all share in the abundance of God. Now there's one other symbol here that is a Judy original, because I didn't read this in any article, but it makes sense to me. I think the other symbol in this story is the mother. She's unnamed, which makes her an unusual character. We say if a character is unnamed and they do not speak, they're a flat character. They're just a placeholder in the story. If they are named and they speak, they're a round character, and they are an important part. They're a cog in the story. Something's going to happen through them. She is one of each. She is unnamed, but she also speaks. So that makes me think there's something going on here with the mother of Jesus. What does she do? She calls his attention to an issue. If we're in the abundance of God, where's the wine? There isn't wine for everybody. There isn't enough left. There's a lack. And she calls attention to it. She nudges Jesus. She never tells him what to do. She never demands anything. She simply directs his gaze to these empty vats where the wine has already been used up. And I think that's a symbolic role that maybe we all need to embody. Now let's go back to Martin Luther King Jr. for a moment. As a child growing up, what do you think are the stone jars, the old order in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Deep South at that time? Don't you think segregation is one of those jars? Racism is one of those jars. Poverty. There were no black high schools until Alberta petitioned for a black high school and worked without ceasing until a black high school was opened. So black children couldn't even continue their education at all without a school. So all of those things are part of this old order. And this is something that he has to be aware of. And he becomes aware of it one day when he is 6 years old. Martin Luther King Jr. He has a friend who is white. And this little white friend his father has a store across the street from the King home. And so Martin and this little white boy would play together, and they were the best of friends. Until one day, the little boy said to Martin, "I can't be your friend anymore. My dad said, I can't be friends with you because you're black." I don't think he said it that nicely, by the way, but that was the instruction. Martin was heartbroken over this. So he goes home, and it's Alberta who holds him and explains to him, this is the old order. This is what we are standing against. This isn't right, and we know it's not right, and we know it hurts. She calls attention to the lack. She shows him what the problem is. And then she moves him to where he can see a better future. Because that day, he decided he was going to hate all white people. That was enough for him. When you're a child and you're already learned to hate all white people, that's not the place you want to park. And she doesn't let him park there. She makes him look ahead. And she says, no, this is not the Christian way. We don't do it this way. We don't hate anybody. We need to love our white neighbors. And we are going to hold that picture of the beloved community where everybody loves one another, where everybody has enough, where everybody is part of God's family, where no one is left behind or forgotten. That's the vision of the beloved community, and that's the vision that Alberta plants in young Martin. So we can see the symbolism for Jesus, and we can see it for Martin Luther King Jr. as well. Now, there is one problem in our text, and I think it's a doozy. And the problem in our reading today is Jesus. Andy, you did a really nice job of reading Jesus' lines as if you were just very kind. When I read that text, I don't read it quite like that. His mother says, look, they have no more wine. And he says, woman, what's that got to do with me? That's not my problem, not my circus, not my monkeys. I don't have to deal with that. It's not my time. What? What do you mean? It's not your time? What is your time? Well, John chapter 17, skip ahead. It's finally his time. What's he been doing for 16 chapters, right? What's happening here? Jesus is being rude, and he is reluctant to help. And that should make all of you upset, because he shows us God, right? Doesn't he show us who God is? Who wants to pray to a God who says, you again? I am so sick of this. You made your bed, now lie in it. I'm not dealing with you humans anymore because this is your own mess. We can't worship a God like that. And here's Jesus being rude to his own mother. Now, when I looked up all the articles on this, and believe me, there were lots, the more progressive scholars said, we can't understand why Jesus is acting this way. We don't know why he says what he says. But if you read the real conservative scholars, the apologists, they will pretty much apologize for Jesus. And they'll say things like, well, it was normal and customary at that time for a man to call his mother woman. No, it wasn't. And it was customary for him to push away and not let her boss him around. She wasn't bossing. And I'm sure that he had a really good reason for doing it, and so, we're just going to leave that right there. He's got a good reason. Well, I really struggled with this, because I don't think he has any reason. If my kids talked to me like that, you know what would happen? It wouldn't be what Mary did. Because what she does, when Jesus tells her, I'm not doing this, it's not my problem, she turns away to the servants and she says, do whatever he tells you to do. She doesn't let it affect her at all. Now, Pastor Eric Strickland says he thinks there's a missing verse in there. And it is a verse that falls right after what Jesus says to his mother, the snarky attitude, and her turning away and speaking to the servants. And he thinks that the missing verse is the mom look. I did not raise you like this. You were brought up better than this. She doesn't have to say a word. She just looks. How many of you have been the recipient of the mom look? Yes. All she had to do was look at him, according to Eric Strickland, and then turn away and tell the servant she is absolutely 100% sure he's going to do what he's supposed to do. And he does. But it still begs the question, why did he act the way he acted? And I could not find a single scholarly, peer-reviewed journal anywhere. I even searched video interviews with scholars. I couldn't find anything. Until I remembered our message from last week. I listen to my own sermons. Actually, you all listen to me talking to myself every week. That's what this is, because I'm learning, and as I learn it, then you get to listen in on the whole process, which is a little scary. Thanks for being here. Anyway, when I started thinking about Wicked, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back on YouTube and you can watch Wicked, the sermon from last week. In that sermon, we talked a little bit about theologian Marjorie Suchocki, and she suggested that we are all born into this bent system. And we don't even know it's there because it was formed long before we arrived. And that bent system, it actually bends our choices without our knowledge and against our will and without our consent. And we don't even know it. And Jesus was born into that system. And so I think what we see here in our text today is Jesus in his humanity reacting under the pressure of that bent system, the system of patriarchy, the system where women don't count, where other people's problems are not my problems. It is the force of that system that causes Jesus to say what he said. And when Mary, not Mary, mother of Jesus, walks away, we can imagine that he is left standing there with his own words hanging in the air. And he sees how his response is a product of the system in which he lives and is not a product of God. And I think that's the real sign in this story. Water into wine, we can do stuff like that if we just use some food color or whatever. Nobody will know. But that inner shift, to me, it happened because he went from, not my problem, what are you bugging me about it for, to go fill up those jars with water and draw some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. Something in Jesus shifts and changes. And I think that's the sign. Now, you can go ahead and hang on to the wine if wine is important to you as the sign. All scholars say, yes, that is the first sign. There's no miracles, by the way, in John's gospel. There's only signs. There's 7 of them, and they are all supposed to point us to understanding that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah. But to me, the water into wine is the smallest part of this story. The most important part is that inner shift when he realizes he's in the wrong and he needs to change. And I love that about him. That is somebody I can follow. Somebody who can become aware and make a change. Now, I want to tell you something a little disturbing because I want you to have the rest of the story. You know what happens to Martin Luther King Jr., right? He is assassinated. You know what happens to Jesus. He is crucified. We know what happens to the mother of Jesus because she is venerated and made into some kind of saint and people pray to her today. At the end of John's gospel, I want to point out that he says something else to her. In this text, he calls her woman, and he says it in a way that is not nice. But when he's hanging on the cross, she is there with him. Can you imagine the pain of seeing your own child, and some of you have, go through that kind of agony? But she is there with him, and this other beloved disciple, who also has no name, is there too. And again, Jesus says to her, "Woman, behold your son." And he entrusts her into the care of this other disciple. And when he says woman there, it took me in my mind right back to our story today when he said woman. But this time, it's almost as if he is thanking her, woman. I remember that day that I made that shift, that change. You were responsible for that. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. also noticed that in his own mother, because when he was in college, he used to write her letters thanking her for teaching him all the things she taught him. And he told everybody who would listen that she was the best mother that there ever was. And 6 years after he was assassinated, Alberta was sitting at the organ, playing the organ as she did for her church, playing the Lord's Prayer, when someone in the crowd stood up and shot her and killed her. They wanted, this shooter wanted to shoot Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., but he said she was closer and he had a better shot. This is the old order, friends. This is what we cannot allow to continue. Those are the times we need to speak out. And today, we are still in a time when we cannot afford to be silent. We cannot afford to not say anything when we see different groups being persecuted and marginalized and oppressed and watch their rights be taken away. Because if we don't speak now, no one will remember what you do not say, right? But they might remember something you do say. So you start with your own family and you say, this is what's happening in our nation and this is wrong. And then you follow it up with action. Because the biggest thing that Alberta King taught Martin Luther King Jr. is that Christianity does not mean you sit in a pew for an hour a week. It means that you are active. Faith is not faith unless it is combined with activism. That is what Alberta taught them. And that is what we need to remember today. Faith is not faith unless there is an action that accompanies it. And so what I'm challenging you to do today, as you remember the things that your mother told you and how it impacted you, I want you to be the mother, the symbolic mother of our story today. Find out who your representatives are and who your senators are. You don't need to know all the bills they're voting on, but you can find out. There are some really scary bills in different states being voted on very soon. Make your voice heard. Pick up the phone. Call. You don't have to have the House bill or Senate bill numbers. All you need to do is say, I'm calling on behalf of my granddaughter. I want her to have health care when she grows up. Or I'm calling on behalf of my friend who works in my church, whose rights could be taken away. I want to make sure that you are representing me the way that you're supposed to. Be the mother. Call it out. When you see that the wine is running out and there's not going to be an abundance for everybody, be the person who uses their voice. Do it for your mom. Do it for Alberta. Do it for yourself. What are you willing to say?